In the summer of 1858, Illinois became the loudest political stage in the United States, not because it was glamorous, and not because anyone expected it to decide the nation's future, but because two men, Abraham Lincoln and Stephen A. Douglas, agreed to argue about slavery, democracy, and the meaning of the country's founding ideals in front of crowds that treated politics like a modern-day championship match. The result was a series of debates so electric that they turned a relatively obscure lawyer into a national figure, sharpened the moral and constitutional fight over slavery, and previewed the collision that would soon tear the Union apart. This was not polite discussion. It was a public contest for power, reputation, and the soul of the Republic. The challenger and the champion. Stephen A. Douglas entered 1858 as a political celebrity, an incumbent senator, nationally famous, and campaigning with confidence and spectacle. Lincoln was his opposite, awkward, lesser known, and long accustomed to being underestimated. Even Lincoln joked about the imbalance, admitting Douglas looked destined for greater power while no one expected much from him. But Lincoln held one advantage Douglas couldn't buy: a clearer sense of purpose. His House-divided warning reframed the contest as more than politics, turning it into a moral argument over whether the nation could survive its deepest contradiction: why Douglas couldn't say no. Douglas initially acted like he didn't need Lincoln. In his mind, why share a platform with a challenger? But politics has a weakness. It loves spectacle. Douglas was too competitive, too proud, and too aware of the crowd's appetite to refuse for long. He accepted the debates, and in doing so, helped create the very stage that would elevate his opponent. The debates became events. People traveled, gathered early, and treated the speeches with the kind of emotion usually reserved for grand sports rivalries. Cheering, booing, laughter, and heckling were all part of the atmosphere. It was democracy in its loudest, most theatrical form, because the stakes felt enormous, even if many in the crowd didn't fully understand how enormous. What is self-government? Douglas centered his argument on self-government, claiming communities should decide for themselves whether to allow slavery. Tied to popular sovereignty, it sounded democratic: let the voters choose. Lincoln exposed the flaw. If only white voters were deciding the fate of black people, that wasn't self-rule, but domination. Governing yourself is liberty, he argued. Governing yourself while owning another human being is despotism. That distinction stripped away the slogans and revealed that Douglas wasn't solving the slavery question, only disguising it as choice. Fear, ridicule, and racial panic. Douglas fought by exploiting fear. He painted Lincoln and Republicans as dangerous radicals who wanted full racial equality in every part of society, deliberately provoking applause and outrage from anxious white voters. In the 1850s, those fears were powerful, and Douglas used them to trap Lincoln: either accept total equality and lose support, or deny it and appear dishonest. Lincoln answered cautiously. He condemned slavery as morally wrong and contrary to the nation's founding ideals, but he also reflected the racial limits of his time, separating freedom from full social equality. He was not an abolitionist demanding immediate transformation, but a politician trying to push opinion forward without losing the electorate. That tension makes the debates revealing, showing Lincoln as both morally awakened and constrained by the assumptions of his era. Lincoln's secret weapon. Lincoln's arguments worked because he built them like proofs, not sermons, step by step, forcing people to follow the logic. He kept returning to the Declaration of Independence as the nation's moral compass, insisting its words couldn't be twisted to excuse slavery. His bigger move was linking morality, law, and national identity into one claim. Slavery wasn't just a flaw in the system, it contradicted the country's founding promise. That made compromise feel temporary, because if slavery was wrong, it couldn't be managed forever. Douglas tried to keep it a local choice issue, but the debates revealed how irreconcilable their visions really were. The outcome that looked like a loss. On paper, Lincoln lost. Douglas kept his Senate seat, helped by Illinois' system in which the legislature chose the winner. By 1858's official result, Douglas survived. But the debates gave Lincoln something far more valuable: national attention. Newspapers spread his arguments across the country, introducing him as a challenger who could match Douglas in wit and principle. His defeat became a platform, turning his losses into momentum, and in politics, that kind of story can be more powerful than victory itself. 1860. Victory, then the floor, drops out. 2 years later, the country handed Lincoln the presidency. The election was not just a change of leadership, it was a signal that the political balance that had held the Union together was snapping. Southern leaders had warned that if Lincoln was elected, they would leave. When it happened, they acted. South Carolina moved first. Other states followed. By early 1861, multiple states had seceded and formed a new government, the Confederacy, with Jefferson Davis as its president. Their central motive was not mysterious. They were determined to protect slavery and its future. Lincoln entered office facing the worst possible welcome: a nation already breaking apart, a president-elect under threat. Lincoln's journey to Washington in February 1861 was tense and dangerous. Facing real assassination threats, he took a roundabout route and entered the capital secretly at night, especially to avoid danger in Baltimore. Reactions were divided. Some saw prudence, others mocked him as fearful, and cartoons ridiculed his caution. Even before taking office, his courage and legitimacy were questioned. Yet Lincoln arrived safely, and the true danger ahead was no longer an assassination plot, but a nation on the brink of war. Firm without a fuse. In his first inaugural address, Lincoln tried to do something extremely hard: sound strong without sounding like an invitation to war. He promised the federal government would hold and protect its property, forts, armories, and institutions, while also insisting he did not want conflict. He appealed to shared bonds and a common national identity, closing with language that became famous for its emotional pull: the idea that the country's memory and connection could still awaken the better angels of our nature. It was beautiful writing, but writing alone couldn't stop history's momentum. The war becomes real. When the first major battle came near Manassas in July 1861, also known as Bull Run, many in the North expected a quick, decisive outcome. The armies were inexperienced, enthusiasm ran high, and the public's understanding of war was dangerously romantic. Some spectators even came to watch with picnic baskets, as if the battlefield were a grand outdoor performance. Then, reality arrived at full speed. Confusion, panic, and a fierce Confederate counterattack turned the day into a humiliating Union retreat. The sight of defeated, wounded soldiers streaming back toward Washington made the war tangible in the most terrifying way. The idea of a short conflict collapsed. Lincoln saw that this would be long, grinding, and costly. The slow turn toward emancipation. As the war dragged on, pressure on Lincoln exploded. Abolitionists and Black Americans demanded action, and more voices argued that slavery wasn't only immoral, it was powering the Confederate war effort. Lincoln felt trapped by law and politics. He believed the Constitution limited his ability to end slavery where it already existed. But as commander-in-chief, he began to view emancipation as a wartime necessity. After Antietam, in September 1862, he issued a preliminary Emancipation Proclamation with a deadline for the rebelling states. When they refused, he made it final on January 1, 1863, shifting the war's purpose toward destroying slavery, not just preserving the Union, and reshaping how the world understood the conflict. Grief turned into moral clarity. By March 1865, the war had visibly aged Lincoln. His second inaugural address reflected that weight: somber, reflective, and deeply moral rather than triumphant. He suggested the war was a shared punishment for slavery, noting that both sides prayed to the same God. Instead of vengeance, he called for healing, responsibility, and a just peace. The speech endures because it confronts the nation's suffering honestly, refusing to treat it as accidental or undeserved. The ending that felt like cruel irony. In April 1865, as the war was ending, Lincoln briefly relaxed and went to a play at Ford's Theater. There, he was shot and killed, stunning a nation that had just survived its greatest trial. His funeral train drew unprecedented crowds as Americans gathered to mourn and make sense of the loss. A leader who rose from hardship, carried the country through war, and died at the moment of victory was instantly transformed into legend. Lincoln's story reminds us that history isn't shaped by perfection, but by courage under pressure, moral growth, and the willingness to act when the cost is highest. If you found this journey through one of America's most defining moments insightful, help support the channel, like and subscribe.